Hello, everybody. On behalf of our board chair, Chris Jotnik, and the whole team and the board at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, welcome to the 11th and first virtual Mary Robinson Speaker Series on Business and Human Rights. My name is Kirsty Jenkinson, and I'm extremely lucky to sit on the board of the Resource Centre. I can't tell you how highly I think of the Resource Centre's global staff and all that they do every day to shine a light on human rights issues as they are impacted by business activities. Many thanks to the Resource Centre's funders as well, who support this critical and impactful work, many of whom I know are on the call with us today. In my day job, I work at the California State Teachers Retirement System, or CalSTRS. It's a $260 billion pension fund for California's educators. I lead our Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies team. We manage a portfolio of over $7 billion of assets, and we also seek to use our influence as a significant global investor to promote more sustainable business practices and public policies. The topic of today's discussion, informed by the insights of the Resource Centre and its partners, is one that investors have to understand, evaluate and address with any hope of building the inclusive low carbon economy that our beneficiaries depend upon. As many of you might know, every year in the speaker series, we tackle a topic relevant to the business and human rights movement. And of course, this year is no exception. And we're focused on the topic that everyone unfortunately is talking about, the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as you all know and can witness, is a global phenomenon that particularly impacts the work that we do around business and human rights. From worker safety to building a just recovery that addresses core inequalities, I think you'd agree that human rights and the role of business are integral to every conversation that should be taking place about COVID. I want to alert you all to just one small change in the printed agenda. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Monica Ramirez, is no longer able to join us today, but we're delighted that Bruce Goldstein, the president of Farm Worker Justice, is able to participate in the discussion. Thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us and all of our partners in today's event. Now, before we dive into the discussion, let me share a few logistical notes. Because we're virtual this year, we have a particularly amazing array of speakers from all over the world, and all of them really deserve to be spotlighted. So we've therefore forgone a keynote speech this year, and instead we'll hear from all our participants in a panel discussion with Mary Robinson, followed by a question and answer session with you, our virtual audience. Now there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that any time during the session to propose a question to the panel. We'll collect those and we'll use those in the Q&A session. Please don't use the chat box or use the raise a hand function for questions. Now, the event is being recorded and it's been live streamed, and you're encouraged to live tweet as well using the hashtags #JustRecovery and #EHR Speaker Series. We'll also put them in the chat box now. There they go. Now, since we don't often have a chance to engage with over 400 people interested in business and human rights, and since we always really try and prioritize audience engagement in this, our Mary Robinson Speaker Series, every year, we want to start out the session with a couple of questions to all of you. So we're going to put some polling questions up on the screen, and if you could vote for your answer in the pop-up boxes that appear, that'll enable us to take a little sense of where everybody is on various issues. So question 1, what has been the strongest driver of abuse of workers' rights in the context of the pandemic? If you could click one of those, that would be much appreciated. And then question 2, which of the following is the most important condition to apply to corporate bailouts? I'll leave you a little minute there. I believe we might get some results. I can't see any on my screen, but I think we're going to be able to look at those a little bit later. So thank you very much for your participation in that. Without further ado, let's get to the real heart of today's session, and let me have the great pleasure to introduce and hand over to Mary Robinson, for whom, of course, this annual speaker series is named. As I think many of you will know, in addition to being the former President of Ireland and the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary is the chair of the Elders and is also currently an adjunct professor for climate justice at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. She's also the chair of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre's International Advisory Board. And Mary, we could not be more thrilled and honoured that you're able to join us this year to host the 2020 Speaker Series. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Can you hear me? Am I on? No.
Yes.
I'm on now, okay. Well, thank you very much to you, Kirsty, but also to Phil and to all at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre for hosting this event every year. I can't believe it's the 11th year, and I always feel very honoured, but also very humbled by the incredible panel that comes together and the issues that are discussed at this event. As you've heard, this is our first virtual speaker series. And even though we're not able to be together in person at our usual lovely venue at Roosevelt House, I'm looking forward to our usual very lively discussion and participant engagement, especially during the wider Q&A later on. One silver lining of doing this virtually is our ability to bring in participants from all over the world who can't be in New York during UNGA Week, and to widen our audience beyond the capacity of Roosevelt House to some 400, I understand, who have joined us. I'm delighted that we'll be hearing the perspectives of such a diverse and wonderful international panel, including labour organisers, women's rights activists, and labour rights experts from different sectors. Although our speaker series on business and human rights typically focuses on one region or one sector each year, this global approach is appropriate for our topic today and the circumstances that we're living in. The COVID-19 pandemic has upended all our lives and threatened the health and the well-being of nearly everyone on the planet, not equally, but we're all out of our comfort zone. But the group that has collectively faced the most severe impacts are workers, especially women and those at the bottom of the global supply chains, who already experienced precarious circumstances before the pandemic. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the deep inequalities that existed between companies and the workers and communities they depend on, often pushing the worst impacts onto the least capable of absorbing them. Our panelists today are exceptionally well placed to speak to the situations facing workers now and the structural conditions that led to such grave impacts on their lives and livelihoods during the pandemic. But equally importantly, today we'll talk about what the road to recovery should look like. A rapid return to business as usual will only serve to reinforce existing deep inequalities. Instead, I hope we will use this as a moment to reimagine and rebuild an economy that serves and respects the rights of all. I look forward to hearing from our speakers their visions for what this new economy could look like. We'll start with questions to the 5 panels that I will introduce, and I'll introduce each as I ask them their questions. After some exchanges between us, I'll then ask our final speaker, my very dear friend, Sharon Burrow of the ITUC, to share her impressions and takeaways from the discussion. And then I'll hand it back over to Shauna, and I look forward to her moderating the questions and comments from the audience. So let me begin then by introducing my first panelist, Ananya Bhattacharjee, and I'm sure I've mispronounced that name, but Ananya, it's lovely to introduce you as the International Coordinator of the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, a global supply chain campaign to demand living wages for garment workers in Asia. You're also the founder and president of the Garment and Allied Workers Union in the state of Haryana in India, one of the country's largest production hubs. Haryana, first tell us what the impacts of COVID-19 have been on workers in your union and indeed your broader movement.
Those impacts relate to the underlying conditions that those workers face in terms of the structure of the supply chain that they're part of, you know, the business model of the apparel industry, etc. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Robinson, and thank you.
You can call me Mary.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And it's an honor to be on the same event with you. And thank you to Business and Human Rights Center for inviting me today. I'll just take off from what you just said, which is that COVID-19 has had a huge impact on especially those people who have the least control over their lives. And these are the workers of the global supply chains, which believe in a business model that is based on low wages and the vulnerability of workers. So in the workers that I represent are garment workers. And although I have a union in North India, Asia Floor Wage Alliance works across Asia. So when I make my comments, I'm really talking about garment workers in Asia. As we all know, the fast fashion industry is really driven by the global brands, and they have created a successful business model where low wages in production countries and ability to sell the same product at higher retail price in the consumer countries, this exclusive access to both these points make the business model very successful for brands. Unfortunately, it is based on the vulnerability of workers. So what we find is that women who are the dominant workforce of this industry and who are also mainly migrant workers, domestic migrants, that is within their own countries, migrant workers, and are often the first industrial workers in the country, because the garment industry is often the first industry when a country is trying to become industrialized. So in this scenario, we have women workers being hired at extremely low wages and being subject to gender-based violence and harassment at the workplace, because it is part of an industrial relations policy to integrate gender-based violence into the employment relationships, so as to create a coercive environment which extracts the maximum production for the lowest wages. These are the conditions under normal circumstances. So what has happened under COVID-19 is that it's really cracked open this global supply chain, where we have extreme exploitation at the production end, profits being siphoned off to the brands at extreme profit levels. We are not against profit, but this is extreme profit levels. And so we have a very unequal global supply chain where the brands do not pay the true cost of production. So in this scenario, when COVID-19 struck, our workers basically have no resilience to face a life where you are losing your income pretty much overnight. They barely have maybe 1 or 2 weeks of resilience. In this scenario, we have workers who are going hungry. They are in fear of losing their homes, that they cannot pay their children's school fees. They certainly cannot access healthcare in these dangerous conditions. And really a tremendous loss of dignity, because what workers tell us is that after having worked so hard for such a profitable industry, why do I have to beg for food just overnight? So this is, and all of our work has been taken up in doing relief work to provide food, to see how workers can get out of homelessness, begging landlords, and these in which women workers are organizing and taking leadership in their community to save their communities. So what COVID-19 has done is that it has really brought into into our awareness, those who were not aware before, the extreme inequalities of the global supply chain, of which the fashion industry is a very famous and probably the oldest example.
Oh, thank you, Anya. It's almost hard to listen to you. It's such a story of, those who are already at the lower end being crushed further, and it's not fair. So can I just ask you a follow-up? Tell me about how your movement is engaging with companies along the supply chain for garment workers to address these issues, and what changes are you demanding from the industry, both in the short term and in the long term?
So the Asia Floorwidge Alliance came about because we want to have a remedy in this supply chain that is across the supply chain and global in nature, because the problem cannot be solved at the level of the nation state. The production countries are now into a development model which has been popularized around the world, which is to open up your labor market to multinationals and basically dilute all the labor laws in order to attract foreign investment. In this scenario, we also have a breakdown of social security and infrastructure for workers. So what we have demanded always is that brands who actually control the conditions of work and control the profitability of supplier factories that hire the workers are responsible for the welfare of the workers. These are their workers. They produce the brand's products. So our main argument is that the brands have to contribute financially to the welfare of the workers over and above the kind of low prices that they are paying. They are not paying for the true cost of production. So in the past, for the last 12 years, we have been demanding that brands contribute towards a living wage for garment workers, because as we see under COVID-19, the poverty level minimum wages create a very low resilience among workers who just go into a desperate situation immediately. So living wage is extremely important. However, at this point, in terms of your question of short-term and medium-term demands that we have right at this moment, Asia Floorwidge Alliance has a demand that we call Supply Chain Relief Contribution, SRC. What we say is that each brand, if each brand pays 2% over and above its last year's sourcing to its supplier, it will be able to cover the wage loss that has been incurred by workers during the lockdown period, which has put them in this situation of starvation and homelessness. So the wage loss during the lockdown, that has to be compensated by brands. In some countries, we have governments pitching in a bit, we have suppliers pitching in a bit, but it's really partial. It is not enough. So brands have to, so we are demanding an SRC in the short term. And in the medium term, we need nothing short of a transformation in the supply chain. In this regard, we mean that the true cost of the supply chain has to be borne by the drivers of the supply chain. They cannot outsource their risks and outsource the cost of compliance, outsource the cost of human rights to those who can least afford them. So we need transformation in the supply chain, and really it's very, very simple. It is a financial costing that has to be borne by brands, not voluntary codes of conduct, not empty promises, not more words and not more research and not more propaganda. We need money on the table. And that is a very small fraction. We have done the calculation, what it will take to deliver living wage for workers. It is doable. We have the numbers for it. We just need the money on the table. We just need the political commitment, because this is going to be a fraction of the advertising budgets of the brands. So the money is there. It just needs to be delivered.
Thank you very much indeed, Ananya. That's very clear, and good luck with all of that. I'm sure there will be other questions later in the open session, but I now need to move to my next panelist. But thank you so much, and keep up that extraordinary work you're doing. And now, as you heard, unfortunately, Monica Ramirez is not able to be with us today, but I'm delighted that we've been able to get a very good substitute very rapidly. And I want to thank Bruce Goldstein for stepping in today in lieu of Monica. Bruce is president of the Farm Workers Justice, a non-profit that seeks to empower and migrant and seasonal farm workers to improve their living and working conditions, immigration status, health, occupational safety, and access to justice. And Bruce himself is a lawyer with more than 40 years' experience working in this field. Bruce, there's been a lot of global news around conditions in other parts of the food supply chain, especially in meatpacking plants, but relatively little about how COVID has impacted agricultural workers. Can you talk about what you've seen this year and how farm workers have organized to respond to this situation?
Yes, thank you, Mary, and thank you to the Center for having me and for having the discussion about farm workers. We really appreciate the opportunity. You mentioned the phrase deep inequality, and certainly farm workers are experiencing for many decades deep inequality in the way they are treated in the United States. During the pandemic, farm workers have been designated by the federal government and by state governments as so-called essential workers. And they are essential workers. They're indispensable to ensuring our food supply. And so they are expected to work. But unfortunately, our government has not required the kinds of safety and health protections that you would expect for people during a pandemic who are facing grave occupational safety and health risks. We're seeing and hearing from all over the country that many farm workers are in workplaces and communities where there are serious outbreaks of COVID-19. There is much illness and there are deaths. And farm workers are already among the most vulnerable people in the United States. They are among the lowest paid workers in the United States. A majority of farm workers, due to our broken immigration system, are undocumented immigrants. They are excluded from many labor law protections that apply to other workers. So they are among the people least able to absorb this special situation, and yet they're told, we expect you to work. Now, some farm workers have actually been laid off or their hours reduced because farms that are producing fruits and vegetables and dairy products that sell to restaurants and restaurant chains have lost their business or most of their business, and they don't have customers, so they've had to lay off farm workers. And so some farm workers have lost their jobs. Many of those who are working are subjected to grave risks of COVID-19. They're often in crowded conditions in the fields. In these days, many workers, even in the fields, are working alongside machines where they're crowded together. They are transported sometimes between fields by the employer. Sometimes they are migrant workers and they travel long distances. Many farm workers, because of their low wages, live in very crowded housing, often with their family members, subjecting them to grave risks of COVID-19. So we are hearing about a lot of illnesses and some deaths. And unfortunately, many employers have not done what's necessary to minimize the risk to farm workers. We're hearing too many reports where farmers are not providing workers with the opportunity for social distancing. We're hearing that a lot of them are not providing adequate numbers of hand washing facilities out in the fields. We're hearing that employers that provide housing are not providing workers with the distance they need and sufficient sanitary facilities in the housing. And this is affecting farm workers as well as their children. Many farm workers are fearful of retaliation if they do report that they feel ill or they do say that they want to get tested. In the United States, the federal government has not required occupational safety and health standards that are specific to COVID-19. So there are not many requirements for employers. We have to basically rely on the good faith of employers or rely on unions to insist or a corporate social responsibility project to insist on safety standards. But in the US, very few farm workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements or corporate social responsibility projects. There is very inadequate access to health care among farm workers. in the United States, inadequate subsidies for healthcare. So it's very difficult for farm workers who want to get tested and then need treatment to actually get that treatment. There's a lack of unemployment compensation, a lack of sick leave, paid sick leave for farm workers. They're excluded from many of the benefits that some other workers get. So the challenges are huge and the needs are great.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Maybe briefly, are there particular underlying conditions that make women farm workers even more vulnerable or especially vulnerable?
Yes, unfortunately, there is evidence of much gender discrimination and gender-based violence against women. There's a lot of sexual harassment in the fields by supervisors of women. They're now faced with the situation of deciding whether or not to ask for testing in the fields. They often have double the requirements that the men have because they are often the main caregivers for their family members. Women are often the people in the family who learn about the health issues and work on getting the needed relief. So there's just tremendous pressure on women, and there's utterly inadequate responses.
Thank you very much indeed. And, I'm glad you've been able to outline just how lacking in dignity and rights farm workers can be in the richest country in the world. It is pretty shocking, but keep up your good work. I have to now move to the next panelist, and you'll get questions presumably from the wider Q&A. So let me move now to Leah Eriyenya, who's the Research, Advocacy and Movement Building Manager at Akina Mama wa Africa. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And in Uganda. And where she's developed feminist research and provides strategic leadership and oversight for advocacy to influence policy change and strengthen the women's and feminist movements in East Africa. So Leah, we've just heard two powerful examples of how the pandemic has particularly impacted both men and women workers, but particularly women workers, as Bruce also highlighted that. How has your work strategizing about and promoting a feminist economy in East Africa and globally changed, if it has changed at all, because of the pandemic?
Thank you so much, Mary. It's a real privilege to share this platform.
And can you turn up your volume a little bit? I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Am I loud now?
That's better. Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Fantastic. I was just saying that it's a real honor to be part of this conversation, and it's an honor for people to listen in to my thoughts. So what Bruce and Anaya have shared is actually an experience that a lot of East African women workers are experiencing. We have a project working with women who work on flower farms. The majority of flower farms have about 70% of their workforce is actually women, and that is also part of the global supply chain. Most of the flowers are exported to the Netherlands. And of course, with the lockdown and the closure of borders, that was an industry that was hit hard because obviously flowers are not as essential as something that you put in your stomach. And that obviously had a ripple effect on workers who are already making a pittance. And yet the companies that they worked for were actually making a killing. And to go to your question specifically about a feminist economy, I always like to make sure that everybody within a conversation has a common understanding of what we mean by that. When we talk about a feminist economy, we are basically thinking about an economy that is quite equitable, an economy that prioritizes the well-being of everyone regardless of their location in society, and centers the needs of the vulnerable on the margins, especially women, persons with disabilities, migrants, refugees, LGBTI persons, etc. A feminist economy means that people have access to decent work, and has been narrated by Ananya, that is something that is not accessible, that was not accessible before the pandemic and has now been made worse by the pandemic. And when we're looking at decent work, we're looking at a fair wage, you know, people's freedom to organize in a trade union, workplaces free from violence. When we're thinking about a feminist economy, we're thinking about equitable redistribution of resources. So you're thinking about a fair tax just system where people that have a little more pay a little more, and those that don't have as much actually are able to draw from that pool of resources through public services, and that people have control and access to resources that they can exploit for them to live dignified lives, but of course within the planetary boundaries. So a feminist economy is conscious of the planet's important work in being able to absorb waste, and therefore the advocacy is that any kind of growth is within those limits. And of course, as Mary said at the beginning with her address, all of this has now been upended with the pandemic. All the ideals around achieving a feminist economy have been upended with this pandemic. Somewhere at the beginning, when all of us were very unsure about what was happening, there was this sense of collective doom. And then there was also an opportunity for collective thinking and strategizing. And people started saying, or at least from my circles, you could see that people started thinking that there should be an alternative to the way that we've been doing things. And this was presented through just the changes in the environment. Because we were consuming less, you know, there was less carbon in the air. People could see mountains that they'd never seen before. From Nairobi to New Delhi, people were sharing all these pictures of nature. And for the first time, it could be possible that this thing that feminist economists had been talking about, this other world where we all are very conscious of our environment, could be possible, where there was some kind of equality could be possible. But of course that lasted a very short time, and now we are back to where we were before the pandemic. And the argument at that point had been that we cannot go back to normal because normal was not working for the majority of the population. But very, as can be seen now, we're going back to that. And so this pandemic has made the work of achieving a feminist economy so much farther out of reach, because number one, it has reversed gains that had already been gotten, and it has stalled very critical, very important work that was being done by activists, being done by academics, trade unionists, and the things of the like. Gains around equitable economic policy, gains around fair business practices, because it's just really very difficult to do advocacy work in an environment where everybody is belt tightening. If you're going to a flower farm and you're asking them, you can't start having a conversation around living wage when people are telling you that all planes have been grounded and my bottom line has suffered. So workers' interests or workers' needs are no longer part of the priority. It means that in terms of stalling, it means that we're going to have a huge price to pay in the future. When we look at our education system, the past couple of months, the majority of children have been out of school, and the people that have suffered the brunt of that have actually been girls. If you look at countries like Kenya and Uganda, tens of thousands of girls within a period of 3 months have actually fallen pregnant. These are not societies where girls who get pregnant while still in school can easily re-enter, which means that their prospects of a good life, of jobs that actually pay a better wage have strongly reduced. But also when we're looking at the government care package, when we're looking at the stimulus packages, and how important it is that they should be equal and that they should not be gender blind, it is so much harder now because the governments that we're working with have limited resources, such that it is not possible to meet some of the demands that activists are asking for. So for example, in other wealthier nations, as we saw stimulus stimulus checks being passed on here and there, here in East Africa, women workers had to fend for themselves. And you have to realize that the majority of these women are in the informal sector, which means that they're not simply transferring their conversations to Zoom as we are doing now. It means that their business is closed, and for a period of 2 to 3 months, had absolutely nothing to feed on, nothing to feed their families with. And in a situation where a government would have actually come and helped, there were actually no resources. And these resources are not there because we don't have fair tax systems. The majority of resources are lost through tax evasions. The corporations that we're talking about are not paying their fair share of taxes. And so a lot of the pandemic response is very, very debt and corporate driven. And the people that actually end up benefiting from it are the corporations. So basically the dream of achieving that economy has been flung far into the future and farther out of reach.
Leah, I'm very open to everything you've been saying, because I have a podcast which talks about climate change being a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution. So you can tell that I'm on your wavelength on lots of what you said, but in the interest of time, I have to move on to the next panelists. I'm sure you will get more questions later, but I need to move now to Tulsi Narayanasamy, who is the Senior Labour Rights Lead at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre itself, where she leads work on global supply chains issues, including freedom of association, living wage, and forced labour. Tulsi, even before the pandemic, the Resource Centre was looking at the structural issues that perpetuate inequalities between workers and companies. And the pandemic has obviously pushed those issues to the forefront of everybody's minds. Tell us about how companies are responding.
Thanks so much, Mary. So to clarify what we mean when the Resource Centre talks about the structural nature of the inequalities between companies and workers, we see this in two ways, really. So the first way is we consider business models and the structure of supply chains. And I think Ananya has already touched on the kind of gross inequality that exists within them. But we also really mean, what is it that drives business behaviour? And obviously that became incredibly apparent to all of us when we saw the extent to which shareholder primacy drives corporations. The second way that we look at the structural nature of this inequality is we consider the regulatory and governance framework that defines the kind of parameters with which corporations can behave within, that minimum floor for corporate accountability. And what we ultimately saw was that that floor wasn't really there, or not really doing what we would have hoped that it would. So in kind of breaking down the company responses that we saw then within that framework, looking at the business model, that short-term return on investment was something that became incredibly apparent. And for many of you listening in today, this is something that we've all worked on for a great many years. There are activists who have pushed back on this forever. And I think what we really saw is that cold, hard reality of what that looked like for workers. We saw that incredible immediate impact of the business decisions, for example, within the apparel industry, as Ananya was saying, when they chose to cancel orders, the apparel companies, that had an immediate knock-on effect to suppliers' abilities to be able to pay wages for their workers and to be able to ensure that those workers weren't on the brink of starvation or left out on the street. And ultimately it was a terrible, and continues to be a terrible, humanitarian disaster. We tracked those responses of 35 different apparel companies on our website. And what we did notice is that how companies responded seemed to shift in accordance to the pressure that we were putting on them. While we had an incredible number of companies, and I should say we weren't the only organization that was tracking these impacts, there was also the Workers' Rights Consortium and Clean Clothes Campaign that were doing incredible work, and we were all working together to really understand which companies were cancelling orders and what those effects were. So tracking that on our website was something that we had to continually do. And we did notice that in response, a huge number of activists led by trade unions and organizations managed to shift the position of a few of the brands. So they did a whole about 10, and where they had said that they weren't going to be paying their suppliers, they ended up paying that. And it was a real moment to recognize that there was power in us to be able to move them. And that leads me to my second point around risk. So we really noticed that with the company responses, they respond to risk, their internal assessment of risk and how much that is going to impact on their public image. And this is something that, again, we notice not only with the cancellation of orders within the apparel industry, but it's something that we also noticed, you know, in terms of their response on individual cases of rights abuses that were taking place across supply chains. So, for example, as workers were rising up to demand that they were having their wages paid, to demand that they were having severance paid for those many millions of workers who've already lost their jobs. You know, there were cases where companies were being asked to ensure that workers who were unionized were being protected, and that those workers who were losing their jobs weren't disproportionately those workers who belong to unions. And, you know, at incredible cost to themselves, as workers always face when they belong to unions. You know, they faced brutal crackdowns, often involving police forces. We saw the use of tear gas against garment workers in Bangladesh, for example, really terrible scenes. And I guess our ability to be able to push brands to respond better was a moment that we were hoping to see something more from, and unfortunately we didn't. And we've documented that in a recent report that we put out on union busting. And the final point I wanted to make just around the company responses is what this has meant for our understanding on the regulatory framework. And I think I've already said, and a number of people have already said, that the regulatory framework has failed workers. It simply doesn't exist. The corporate infrastructure that exists when it comes to the contracts that suppliers in factories might have with their workers, you know, all of these kinds of things at every level, that inequality is there. And I think this has really provided us with an opportunity to push for much stronger regulation of corporations to lift that standard of their accountability to workers.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Tilsi. I'm sure a number of these issues will come up again in the broader discussion, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to my next panelist, David Pitt-Watson. He's a business and social entrepreneur and co-founder of Hermes Focus Asset Management. He's been active in global efforts to promote responsible investment, including co-chairing the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative. David, as an investor, how have you seen investors respond to the pandemic, and especially the protection of workers' rights in their investments? Do you feel optimism that investors can be a force for good in building a just recovery?
Hey, I'm going to end up being optimistic, Mary, but I think if you've just heard those four people speak and you think about what the response of business has been, where people can say that violence is part of industrial relations, that the workers are making a pittance while the owners are making a fortune, and it's all because of shareholder primacy and so on and so forth. When you hear that sort of thing, it's very difficult to tell the positive story. I think though there is a positive story, and it's important that we get hold of it, because what we've heard is quite a traditional view, I think, of investor versus worker. One's on one side and one's on the other side, and the investor is trying to exploit the worker. But actually, our very first speaker, Kirsty Jenkinson, who comes from an investment house, and it's an investment house that is representing billions of pounds. They belong to teachers in California. And teachers in California, she said, want an inclusive and sustainable future to live in. And that seems to me to be a point of great optimism, that actually the really big chunky amounts of money that are in our system right now are owned by millions upon millions of people that are saving for pensions, or by sovereign wealth funds like Norway's, which owns 1% of every a company in the world. And look, CalSTRS doesn't want to see this sort of thing being done by companies. That's why I think it's CalSTRS that are sponsoring the Apparel Tracker Initiative, with the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. I noticed we've got Sharon Burrow talking to us at the end of this. I've just come off the phone a couple of days ago to another Australian trade unionist, but this one doesn't run the International Trade Union Congress. This is somebody who runs the Principles for Responsible Investment, of which now proudly boast $103 trillion. That's a really big amount of money. $103 trillion that are signed up trying to be responsible investors. And therefore, I think we've got some really interesting things to think about, which is how do we manage to bring those investors on our side in trying to promote what it was that Kirsty was talking about, which is this inclusive and sustainable economy, both as we go through COVID and even more as we come out of COVID. I know there are some companies that'll be listening in on this call. They should recognize that if they're going to serve their shareholders, these are public service workers in California. These are the people of Norway. These are postal workers in the UK. That's who they should be serving. That's where they owe their loyalty. For those that are campaigners with companies as well, that it's not abnormal that you should be asking them that they're protecting human rights. Of course they need to be profitable, that's very important, but they can walk and chew gum at the same time, I think, and that it's not unreasonable to be asking that. But by the way, if you want investors to do this, you need to hold the investors to account. The pension funds and even more the fund managers need to be held to account for this sort of thing to be happening. And I hope that I've said enough in that little 3 minutes to engender some questions for our discussion later, Mary.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and I'm sure there will be follow up in the wider Q&A on some of the things you said, and maybe Sharon will also take up some of these things. But I have great pleasure now in handing over to my dear friend Sharon Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. Sharon, you've been listening to the discussion here today, and I'm sure you will be able to tell us your main takeaways. And I think maybe you could link them a little bit with what Ursula von der Leyen said today, because I thought her speech was very interesting, and you can maybe link the two.
Thank you, Mary, and as always, a delight to see you. But what an amazing panel of people! Like, frankly, to the people representing the workers' voices, Anaya, Monica, who did I miss? Tulsi, and I think your advocacy says it all, because that's the situation. Just let me paint for you 3 framing pieces. One, as Mary and others said, before COVID-19, we had a situation where global inequality was destructive. It was generating an age of anger. Why? Because people were in despair. Every continent, you saw people on the streets. Inequality of income, of race, and of gender, because, in fact, the reality for women, as Mary reflected, is that women's progress had stalled on every indicator. And indeed, I kind of thought, oh no, it's a reality. But oh no, when our sister said that, women were again not at the forefront of the agenda and governments didn't have money. We have to fix that. But let me come back to that. We had the climate emergency, and that was destroying lives and livelihoods, with, again, I hate to say, women at the forefront of trying to hold that together. But the human rights abuses that were prevalent in this economic model we built were just unconscionable. And I thought Tulsi did a great job of what we call a global scandal, where 94% of workers in the supply chains before COVID-19 were a hidden workforce. And really it was based on dehumanizing exploitation, because the model is profit first, or shareholder model, or whatever. And that's not the way the best of our economies grew. Why are the Nordic countries so much more equal? Because they shared their wealth. And I've never understood why we want to make wealth if we're not prepared to share it. We're not even talking about everybody being absolutely equal, but if you're not actually going to share, although that'd be a nice idea, but if you're actually going to share wealth, you build prosperity for everybody, including those who would be at the top end of that pyramid. But I also wanted to touch on then the impact of COVID-19. So we already had that terrible environment. We're already demanding a new social contract which covers the things that were mentioned, and I'll come back to a few of them. But now we have almost 500 million workers lost their livelihoods in the formal employment sector. But with 60% of our world now in informal employment, no rights, no minimum wage, no social protection, no rule of law, then 1.6 billion, as you heard, face destitution every day. We must do better than this. We have a chance, as devastating as it is. You've seen a global historic moment where people around the world have showed solidarity to save lives. Yeah, we've got people on the streets claiming civil liberties. Well, I wish they really had their civil liberties attacked. But anyway, people saving lives is a remarkable thing. Now we have to have the same solidarity, and we'll have to demand it because governments aren't there. You know, I addressed the Labor ministers of the G20. You know, we've addressed many of those ministerial meetings. What they're doing in their own country, we've seen great advances, and I'm proud of unions for the advances in the social contract where governments have resources. But there's no coalescing. And one of the things we have to build with resilience is the social protection floor. I don't know how many years Mary and I and Michelle Bachelet and others have promoted this. It kind of feels like, you know, an eon. But it is the biggest resilience piece there is for global shocks, whether or not it's the current working conditions, the loss of income, the climate extreme weather events that will keep coming, further global shocks, including pandemics and economic shocks, whatever it is, there can be nothing more important as we rebuild jobs and inclusive growth, and we set that up in a framework now of sustainability. But we have to be really tough, because I will never accept that governments can say, no, we can't put women at the forefront of social protection or equal employment opportunities. Together, we can force those governments who right now are not operating together above their own nations in an acceptable way. And I'll leave you with this thought, or two thoughts actually. One is that our demand for a global protection fund, a global social protection fund for the poorest countries, we've spent about 10 trillion, Mary, and we will spend double that to get back to some hope of recovery. Can't be a recovery that is just building back. It's got to be a world that's much more inclusive, much more sustainable, an economy for people. And of that 10 to 20 trillion, we want 35 billion a year for 5 years to set a floor of social protection and a sustainability of that for the future. Come on, a small change, you know, Bill Gates could fund it, Soros could fund it, you know, between them all, they could all chip in, but governments too, the wealthier governments. And this is in everyone's interest. On the investment front, well, we just have to do better, but we have to say, and I'm so happy when a Mercer's reps on the line, because they do understand, even where it's hard to shift their clients, they do understand that unless we actually have investment that is sustainable, and that's on climate, on you know, on equality, on inclusion, then business is at risk. What we've seen, Mary, in those collapsing supply chains and the devastation for people is that our major businesses, many of them don't have 3 months of operating expenses. Some refuse to pay for those orders that you heard Anaya talk about, but others couldn't. They simply couldn't. Now, we said the banks could never be there again. They had to increase their liquidity. What about corporations? And they're taking money from governments. We've advocated some of that to save jobs, but with no conditionality. Come on, we can do better. We have political power. And can I just compliment Phil and of course you, Mary, but the team, because the reports of the circumstances of, you know, corporate collapse, corporate denial, corporate abuse in different sectors, including the ones we heard of. Agriculture worries me. We're all dependent on it, yet it's such an area of indecent work. The informal economy, we're seeing brilliant, resilient stories of people helping each other, but where are our governments? So political power, working together with the business community that Mary and I and others work with, who do know they have to change the future. Not big enough yet in numbers, but they do know the future needs to be different. But we can't step back and watch this world recreated. It's that simple, Mary. And I think I can't do any better than the stories and the analysis of what a brilliant panel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I do agree it was a brilliant panel, and your framing comments were really very apt and appropriate. And I loved in particular your reference yet again to the need for a social protection floor and the need for a fund, a global fund on social protection. And that would be the human response if we really understood the solidarity of human beings. In the interest of time, though, I must turn over now to Shauna Bader-Blow of the BHRRC board, a board member, and she will conduct the Q&A. Over to you, Shauna.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much for your leadership in the space of business and human rights, also your feminist leadership for all of us who aspire to better governance, better government, and better economies led by brilliant feminist women like you. Thank you. I wanted to start sort of where Sharon started leaving off. You know, when I was listening to the amazing presentations that you gave, I was hearing all the devastation that is facing workers, but in your stories and in your activism, what we see and feel is a promise of a better tomorrow with the vision of activists like all of you and your movements. And so I want to start with one question that was a question that came in from Robert about, are we concerned that after COVID passes, that we are going to see a rollback to business as usual from before the pandemic, and what can we do about it? And I want to start by actually throwing that back to Leah about building back better and building a feminist economy. And I also want to hear from Bruce as well, if you could share with us, coming out of COVID, how are we going to build back better for migrant workers in agriculture in the United States? So if we could start with brief interventions from Leah and then Bruce.
Oh yes, thank you so much. I think now is the time to amplify organizing around feminist economies. As I shared earlier about the brief moment that we had about what could possibly be, what our world could possibly look like, and the fact that I think every person who's not part of the 1% has actually, for the very first time, felt the validity of the comments or of the discourse around structural inequality. For the very first time, we can see it in our experiences. Even people that have a bit of money are actually experiencing inequalities that were a bit out of reach. For example, in a country like Uganda, if you just had a bit of money, you didn't have to be ultra wealthy, but if you had just a bit of money, you didn't have to deal with the terrible hospitals in the country. All you had to do was get flown to India and somewhere else. So I think the pandemic has actually presented an opportunity for us to push for the demands that we were always making around decent work, around fair taxation systems, because without resources, then there are no resources for gender justice, because even as we're demanding for governments to fund social protection, there are actually no resources. And so we have to tell them that the resources exist. You simply do not have the political will to actually allocate them to where they'll create the greatest need.
Thank you. And political will, that's a good one to tee you off, Bruce, about building back better in the United States for migrant workers in the agricultural sector.
Yeah, thank you, Shauna. As Leah just said, I think there's an opportunity here. During the first few weeks of the pandemic in the United States, a lot of people had trouble getting food. They started to really think about food insecurity in a way that only poor people have had to worry about in the United States recently. And they started to think about well, who's producing that food? And our state and federal governments said, farm workers, the people working on farms and ranches in the United States are producing our food, and they're quote unquote essential workers. They're indispensable workers. We need them to go to the fields and work. That has given us an opportunity to say, you're right. And not only are they indispensable, but they're not being treated properly. We have an opportunity that we need to seize to empower farm workers. We need to work on immigration reform because a majority of farm workers are undocumented. That lack of status or their guest worker status denies them the ability to really speak up, to join unions, to demand compliance with the law. We need to strengthen the organizing campaigns of farm worker unions. We need to lobby more to get equal rights and labor protections in the US. And the corporate responsibility projects and supply chain, we have to expand those. We're working on the Equitable Food Initiative, which involves international retailers and brands. We need to build on that. And finally, we need to build greater public recognition that farm workers are not beasts of burden. They are people in the fields, and increasingly modern business people who own farms are recognizing that they need farm workers to exercise judgment in the fields and to end this history of low-wage, backbreaking strategies. They need to recognize farm workers for the contributions they're making to the economy and the society and act accordingly. So that's what we'll be working on.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think sticking on the theme of looking to the future and how we're going to build back better with more justice and equality and a changed global economy coming out of lessons we've learned in the pandemic, we had a specific several questions about the role of investors and asset owners that I wanted to throw back to David and again to Sharon. You know, what else can we anticipate in the future in the movement of socially responsible investors? When does it come down to the individual investor as well? What's the role of investment firms, both in holding companies accountable, but also helping change these systems and change the economy for better and for human rights in the future? And I want to start with David and then Sharon.
Yeah, so look, I'd start off by saying that often we interpret the world of business as one that is creating bad things, and that's what you would think in theory it ought to do. Mm-hmm. And I think you might want to turn that round from what I was saying and saying, look, the big pots of money, they do belong to millions of people. The pension funds of Britain have 4 times more assets than the 1,000 wealthiest families. Mm-hmm. So if we can marshal them and get businesses to do it, the job properly, that's a huge opportunity. And in some areas, climate, I think, has been, which I've worked on a lot, is actually a little bit more advanced than workers' rights and human rights. But if we can do this, the prize could be very large indeed. But then let's get realistic about this, because I talked about Kirsty and the great stuff that she and CalSTRS is doing with the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. But CalSTRS will be invested in, I would guess, 10,000, 15,000 different companies. I guess, I don't know, Kirsty, I don't know what I'm saying here really, but there might be a dozen people that do jobs like Kirsty's at CalSTRS. So you need to find something that is simple for people to do. You know, the code of conduct that you can hold a company to account for example, the way that companies calculate their profits relative to sustainability, those sorts of things. And then I saw there was a question about individuals and what do you do if you're an individual, and what do you do if you're a group of individuals like a trade union more? I think I would tend to say organize, push, tell investors that this is what you want to see them doing. And by the way, you're not expecting any lesser pension as a result of that. You're simply expecting that when you do enjoy your pension, in my terms, in a few years' time, and I hope many of the people on the audience in 30 or 40 years' time, that you're enjoying an income, but you're enjoying it in a world that is at one with itself and is not destroyed by a climate catastrophe. So I've just touched on things there, Shauna, but I hope given a sort of an indication of the direction we might go in.
Sharon?
So let me say, first of all, to Bruce, and indeed to all of our speakers, we've got a big fight on our hands to put the heart of what Bruce said, the ILO's Centenary Declaration, a job protection floor, a labour protection floor under every worker, whether they're formal, informal, documented, undocumented, and it is fundamental rights of health and safety, an adequate or evidence-based minimum wage, and indeed maximum hours of work. If we could do that, and that was the rule of law, we changed the face of the dignity of work. And on the wages question, my sister-in-law is so right. We've done the calculations as well. And if we just put $50 a month on Asian workers in the poorest country's salary, which out of the profits of our major company, let alone their advertising budget, I like that, is absolutely affordable, you would lift the hope and the dignity of those workers everywhere. Now, it's a little more in the more developed countries, but that's the poorest of our supply chains. And then I wanted to answer the question, to frame what you said, where Mary asked me to, and I didn't go because of time, van der Leyen. Now, Europe is the hope, but we will have to fight for it, and it becomes a base model then for the world. Why? She's built the recovery on 3 principles: a social pillar of rights, and she's backing that up with minimum wages. She's going to put out a minimum wages directive. Oh my God, is that tense? And yet, why wouldn't we have a living wage of the evidence-based? I mean, come on, business shouldn't operate if they can't pay wages on which people can live. Secondly, to answer David's point, she's actually committed to mandating due diligence, something Mary's fought for and others forever. The UN treaty we want. But if we can mandate due diligence for investors and indeed for employers, where they analyse the risk, not just of finance, but of human rights abuse and environmental contamination or destruction, we put the grievance mechanism in place, we effect the remedy, then we can change it. There's a lot to be said about finance, and indeed, again, the EU's opened the door to where we've been saying you need patient investment, but you now need for recovery patient debt as well. Take the time to allow productive economies to return to the fold. And on the question of inequality, can I say I read a stat today, Shauna, $50 trillion has been indeed raked off the livelihoods of American workers, just American workers, 50 trillion in the last 3 years. I can't go through the wages that they would be earning now, even if they kept pace. But you think about that, $50 trillion. Add the illicit flows from our developing countries that the companies have also taken from our workers in other countries. And we start to see what is, it's just corrupt, fraud, whatever the model of this economy is, we have to change it.
And when I think about the model of the economy, I'd like to think also that we can have global governance systems that help work to make rules that we follow. Sharon mentioned the ILO and a global social protection floor concept. I want to ask the final question, I believe, that came from Nina to Tulsi and Ananya. I'm wondering if you, she asked about the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights National Action Plans process at the country level to hold governments accountable to business and human rights promises. And I wonder if either one of you have been working in your capacities on national action plans, and if you see them as useful tools for the future. Ananya?
Yes, hello. I have not been involved in the national action plans, and except, tangentially. But I would just like to speak to the moment that we are in and the pathway forward. I actually see that we are in a moment when new conversations are possible. I am seeing real coming together of activists in the fast fashion industry as well as climate justice, because the fashion industry is one of the most wasteful industries in the world. And so in terms of really having sustainable global supply chains, which pay living wage and do not promote overconsumption, overproduction. This is a conversation that I believe that the world is interested in. I'm seeing it in industry magazines. It's not a sideline conversation, but it can soon get out of mainstream if we push it there. And this is the moment to really start these conversations so that we can build a better planet.
And Tulsi, if you want to close us out with either a comment on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center is, of course, a major vocal global advocate throughout the UN system for stronger global principles and governance. If you want to comment to close us out on how these tools can be strengthened in the future to help workers have a better future after COVID.
Just to echo the words of what everyone has already said, I think in terms of what this moment represents, I think there is this real ability for us to all reimagine what's possible. I didn't expect you would all be in my spare room at this moment. And I think, you know, if we didn't imagine that before, we can imagine a world that's genuinely holding corporations accountable for the impacts that they have in their businesses on workers. And I think, you know, it was amazing to hear all the comments around our expectations for mandating human rights due diligence in companies. And I think, you know, what has become possible is we can expect, and we should be expecting and demanding, for genuine liability and sanctions for corporations when they do, you know, deny workers their fundamental rights. We are in a moment where we genuinely can start to say it's not okay for workers to not be paid a wage that they can live on. We can find a way to mandate that, and we can find a way to mandate a change to this world where we don't make the same mistakes that we saw made in 2008 at the end of the global financial crisis. We've already seen incredible stats emerge from reports by many organizations like Oxfam to see that wealth has, you know, been accumulated incredibly rapidly by billionaires and by some of the biggest corporations in the world. And it's not too late to turn this ship around. And I think that we have all of the tools we need. We have a strong, united business and human rights movement to do this. And I think if we stand together and are really united in our expectations and our ambitions, I think we can do it.
Well, thank you for that powerful and optimistic view, Tulsi. And I believe listening to this panel that with people like Leah and Sharon, David, Ananya, Bruce, and with leadership like Mary's and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, that we can get there. Thank you to the panelists for a wonderful discussion. I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Marty Flax, who will tell us more about the poll and the rest of our program.
Thanks, Shawn. I'm just sharing the poll results with everybody as we bring on Phil to provide some concluding remarks. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much. And those are obviously very interesting remarks. And these were before we even started the debate, but you can see there this challenge that we all face in terms of how global supply chains are structured, which comes out so importantly in terms of really shifting that model. And we, as part of that business and human rights movement, a diverse movement with companies that are out ahead, that are already changing their global supply chains, investors, as we've heard from David and Kirsty today, along with governments, have an opportunity to make that a reality over the coming period. And again, in terms of what's the most important, there are other areas there that the thing's just gone, so oh, it's back. In terms of the most important conditions to apply to corporate bailouts, the requirement to implement human rights and environmental due diligence comes out substantially ahead. And again, I think I'll come straight back to that in one of my remarks. What I wanted to say just in summary is, firstly, I think we've heard the tragedy of this pandemic. We've heard the scale of human suffering and also that critical point, the loss of dignity that's been faced by so many. But as Mary said, it's not been shared equally. The worst affected have been the people who can least absorb the harm that has been done to them. And therefore, and that's the poorest and people who face the discrimination of gender, of race, of income in our world. But I think we've also heard a huge amount about opportunity. And I do think that there's a groundswell of support for no return to business as usual. There are lots of voices that want that return. There are vested interests that really will make a lot of money out of that return. But there is a groundswell of opinion that says we must use this moment, this tragedy, as also an opportunity for a just recovery. It's an opportunity for transformation, a transformation towards greater equality of wealth. And we've heard there about shared prosperity and also about that social protection floor and the living wage that should go alongside it. And we've also heard about that transformation regarding the equality of power and the need for workers' voice and communities' voices to be heard much more loudly by business and indeed by investors and by governments. We have that opportunity now. I think we've heard very much that there is an appetite amongst some of the largest investment funds towards environmental, social and governance responsibilities, ESG. And those funds, in case anybody doesn't know, have ballooned both in their importance and in their size over the last few years, and in particular during this time of pandemic. But equally, we've got this other extraordinary opportunity of the government bailouts, the trillions that our governments are spending of our money, the public's money, in bailing out companies. And that's a good thing in many ways, if it is also accompanied by transparency and by conditionality. As David has said to me on other occasions, you know, every company understands that if you're going to receive a loan or a grant, you're going to get some conditionality by it. And I think von der Leyen today has set out some of those, you know, a living wage, but also that mandatory human rights due diligence. We need if companies are going to get that grant, in order to ensure no return to business as usual, a condition should be that they have a time-bound plan for a mandatory human rights due diligence, and indeed a time-bound plan to achieve their contribution to the Paris Agreement around climate change. But there are also other key opportunities to put some conditionalities on that will address some of the inequality, such as not paying dividends while in receipt of that until that loan is repaid, and also not using tax havens, those unresponsive tax authorities who will take that money and make sure that the right money is not being paid back to states that are going to so desperately need it to pay for what has been the social protection, at least in some countries. So there's a massive but vibrant agenda, and I think many governments are waking up to it. Certainly we've heard investors are waking up to it, some companies are waking up to it. But underneath all that, as a number of people highlighted, we have to have that groundswell of public opinion driven by civil society, by all the organizations that we've heard from today, to create the conditions where that's not an option, it's an imperative. I want to finish, therefore, just by thanking, first of all, Mary, obviously for your extraordinary leadership in this field over so many years, and particularly now at this time, and for your continued support for the Resource Centre. I really greatly appreciate all the panelists from Ananya, Leah, David, Bruce, Tulsi, and also Kirsty and Sharon who've helped us so much get this together. There's a big debt of gratitude that goes to Marty, one of our directors and members of the management team who has led this whole process and made it happen. But she's been assisted by an extraordinary global team of the Resource Centre, without which we would be nothing. And another way in which we would be nothing is if we didn't have our funders. So thank you to them, because events like this are only possible because of them. And finally, a huge thanks to all the people who've come on today to listen to this. I hope you've found it as much a learning event as I have. Thank you very much.